We've previously discussed the winners and losers of inflation by looking at a kind of very simplistic example of a loan. And I want to return to that to kind of think about both inflation and deflation. And what is deflation? That's when price levels are decreasing, not increasing. And so I want to kind of think about how that can cause a redistribution of wealth and why you might have social pressures, different social pressures when there's really high levels of inflation, or if there are really high levels of deflation where price levels are decreasing, which we've seen in America. We've seen kind of both of those before and in multiple countries across the world. So in this example, we've got kind of a simplified one here. You're going to take out a 1-year loan from a bank to start a business after college, and you're going to borrow $10,000. You're going to borrow it from the bank. The bank is the lender, you are the borrower, and the interest rate on that loan is 6.5%, which you have to repay 12 months from today. And so what would you actually have to repay? Well, you receive, right? You receive $10,000 from the bank. You would have to pay that $10,000 back plus 6.5% on that $10,000, which would be 6.5% times $10,000, which is $650. So you would have to repay a total of $10,650. And your profit or loss, in essence, what I'm saying here is how much would you actually have to repay? Well, you would have to, the difference here is $650, right? That's kind of the extra amount that you had to repay to the bank. And over here, it's just the inverse, right? The bank pays you $10,000. They receive your $10,650 back, and so they make $650. All of this, I think, kind of makes sense, and it's straightforward. We've kind of reviewed it a few different times, and then we've thought about what happens to the real payment schedule. What happens when there's inflation? And so here we can see that all the numbers are the same. And what if we just change this level of inflation? We're going to say that there is 3% inflation, that price levels over that year, over that 12 months, increased by 3%. And so I'm going to put that in, and everything is going to update here. So nothing changes up here. All we see is that this real changes, that the real payment schedule changes. And what is it that changes? Well, we know that the real interest rate is the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate, right? This is kind of the Fisher the Fisher effect that we've thought about before and that we've looked at. And so what is it? Well, we have a 6.5% interest rate. The inflation rate eats away at 3% of that. And so what do you actually have to repay? So you received $10,000 from the bank, and then 12 months later, you had to pay back, right? You had to pay back $10,650. However, what we're saying is that $650, that 6.5% that you had to repay, well, there was inflation reduced the purchasing power by 3% of that. So 6.5 minus 3% is 3.5%. And so what you actually only had to repay, even though you paid back $650 in excess in real dollar, right, in dollars, those dollars can only buy the equivalent of $350 worth of things that 12 months later. And so when we think about the real payment schedule, right, you're actually, in real dollar terms, you are only losing $350. You had an effective, right, you had an effective interest rate of real interest rate of only 3.5%, not this 6.5% in the nominal sense. And the bank, right, well, if you're a little bit better off because you only have to pay because in real dollar terms you only pay $350 instead of the $650, the bank is worse off, right? They're worse off because they're actually receiving that $650, but it only buys less goods than it did before. And so that that inflation rate eats away at their profits. And so if we wanted to kind of summarize here, we could say that what happens with inflation, right? What happens with inflation? Well, you as the borrower, you are better off when there's inflation because you are paying back at the nominal rate, even though what you pay back can only buy less goods than it previously could. The bank, the lender, right, that individual who lent you the money, they are worse off when there is inflation. And so you can imagine, right, at 3%, maybe this is what was expected, and so the bank kind of expected that they were going to make $350 off of that loan. If the inflation rate was 6.5%, for example, in essence, everything in real terms would break even. And so I think that, right, we can see that higher levels of inflation would definitely take away, right, it would make the bank worse off, even worse off. It would make the borrowers even better off. In fact, if we just increase this to 10%, right, we can see that in real terms, you actually borrowed money and you actually made money off of that, right? The bank actually received even less, right? They received no profit at all. So I think on the inflation side, that probably makes sense. What we want to think through now is on the deflation side. What if there's a negative inflation rate? What if the price level decreases? And so I've returned this just back to our 0 just for kind of for the standard set. But what are we saying? If the inflation rate decreases, this would be like during a recession or a depression, for example, where prices decrease because demand has decreased. And so what would maybe happen here? Well, we'd be looking at deflation. And let's say we're looking at deflation. We'll just kind of keep the numbers the same. At negative 3%, prices fall by 3%. Here we can see that what you actually, in real terms, what you pay back is actually much higher, because what you're paying back, right, what's actually happened to the price level, that price level has decreased. And so we can see that you're actually much worse off. And so when we have deflation, right, what happens to borrowers? Well, borrowers are worse off. They are worse off because the money that they've borrowed, right, they have to pay you back, but the price levels have decreased, and so they're actually paying you back more money in real terms. And the bank, as we can see here, they're actually making even more profit. They're making $950 in real terms versus the zero inflation scenario where they would be making $650, and so they are better off. And here again, we can imagine what's happening here. And this is the real key. With deflation, why is it particularly bad for borrowers? Let's just increase this to 10%. Let's say prices fall off of a cliff. And individuals would really be, if you borrowed money, you would be considerably worse off. Because what you were trying to pay back, right, the price levels have decreased to an extent. And so we can just imagine kind of how inflation and deflation have competing interests if you are a lender or if you are a creditor, right? If you lend money or if you borrow money. And so we just want to kind of walk through this simplistic example to kind of think through what are the numbers actually saying and kind of think through why inflation and deflation would be particularly important, or individuals would be particularly interested depending on what side of the ledger they might be on.